Now, as the election campaign comes to its climax, one of the most important issues for many voters is education. All the politicians are promising to raise standards in the classroom, but they have differing views on how to achieve it. So we wonder, which party deserves to win top marks and a glowing report for its policy on schools? Joining us now are the Education Secretary Kenneth Clarke, who's in Nottingham at this early hour of the morning. Also Labour spokesman on education Jack Straw in his constituency of Blackburn. And Lord Holme should be joining us very shortly. Lord Holme of the Liberal Democrats, who should be in our Westminster studio. Good morning to all two of you so far.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us. Mr. Clarke, let's start with you. Under the Parents' Charter, widely praised in many instances, the performance of schools will be publicly assessed to a certain extent. And the question which remains to a certain extent unanswered, what happens to the schools that come near the bottom of the leagues, if we can use a sporting phrase there?
Well, you're certainly right that one of the things the Parents' Charter will produce is more information about the performance of different local authorities and schools than we've ever had before. It was all a deadly secret in the past. No one knew how different schools performed. All now will be opened up. And I think what will happen to those schools which turn out to perform disappointingly, when there's no particular and apparent reason for it, and there'll be some of those, is that the first time people will start asking questions about what is going wrong in those schools, why they're not attaining the performance of similar schools in similar areas, usually in their particular locality or elsewhere in the country. And I think it'll enable teachers, governors and the parents involved in those schools and the local community around those schools to start discovering that there are those places where either they're not getting reading or writing or the basics of numeracy right in the primary schools, or they're performing badly at GCSE, or there seems to be a faltering start in the secondary schools. All that will be exposed, and as in every other area of public service, I think public information will act as a stimulus to the teachers and everyone else with an interest in those schools to get their standards up to the very good standards which, you know, the best of our schools in some parts of the country are already achieving.
But, I mean, fair enough to ask the question, why are the standards slipping in some areas? But the answer as to what was going to happen to the better schools was more quick to the tongue, if you like. It was expansion and more funds. It seems to be a very different approach to the two sets of schools.
Well, where you get an extremely successful school that wants to expand and where parents are particularly anxious to get their children there and the head teacher and the governors are anxious to take an extra form entry, we've altered the rules so that they will get more capital investment. And that is a straightforward sense, it seems to me, of playing to strength. And if you look at it from the point of view, as we always do, from the point of view of the parent, the pupil, the employer, prospective employer, wider society, you invest in strength, you encourage and support those schools which are the best schools in our system. The Liberals in particular do it spectacularly the other way around, and they've more or less been converted to league tables since we suggested them, but they say your reaction should be that you put more money in the ones that perform worst. Now that sounds frightfully fair, and as with most Liberal policy, it calms down the teachers' trades unions, but it isn't a way of raising standards.
It's true, isn't it, that the parties out of power can promise the world and can promise utopia, and one then says, well, where's that money coming from? It's also true, and equally true, and maybe more damaging, that the party in power has to defend a record. Now, your party has been in power for 13 years, and the debate is still classes of 40, leaking roofs, inadequate facilities, poor standards. Admittedly, you're fairly fresh to power in education yourself, but the party, well, the record stands for all to see, a poor record.
We started with education reform in 1987, 1988, when we decided that leaving everything to local government control and leaving everything just to the educational world to determine for itself was not going to get the higher standards we wanted. And we have a great raft of reforms only now beginning to come in, the curriculum just finished, the testing really only starting, the Parents' Charter to come, producing performance tables, I won't go on, but the new qualifications, vocational qualifications just beginning to be designed. All this is an agenda unfinished of reform. I agree with you, and unfortunately, we haven't had much serious discussion during the election. This is, with respect, one of the most serious interviews I've had on education since the debate started that you're now carrying out. Because what happened was the opposition parties, in my opinion, devoid of any real education policy, have reduced the whole thing to a bidding match about sums of money they would add, which in the case of the Labour Party are fairly trivial sums of money. In the case of the Liberals, would add quite to income tax, but The trouble with the Liberals is that their answer for everything appears to be money, and the penny on income tax from education appears to be only a start.
What serious is our time? I'm afraid what serious is our time factor. We'll try and come back to you. Let's go to Jack Straw, who's in Blackburn. Good morning.
Good morning.
Mr. Straw. Now, you're promising a lot of things, and that's fair, and everybody will approve of that. But if you want to bring schools back into local authority, the local authority aegis, the big question then arises. We know what's happened in the past there. The education can slip further down the ladder. Roads may come first, health may come, but what happens to education? So how do you make sure and guarantee that's a priority?
Well, how we make sure that education is the priority is, first of all, by establishing at a national level a body which is going to be called the Education Standards Commission, which will be independent of ministers, reporting to Parliament, which will take over the work and the personnel of Her Majesty's Inspectorate and make them even more independent, there to monitor and to raise standards of every local authority and of every school. And for the first time, it will be local education authorities who will be inspected and checked, as well as individual schools. You asked Ken Clarke a moment ago how you could raise the standards of a school that was slipping, and he didn't frankly give you an answer except to say, well, we'll publish raw information on those schools, and then everybody around the school can ask questions. Well, it's not good enough if you've got a child in a school which is failing, simply to ask questions. You want the questions answered, and you want to ensure and be reassured that the standards are going to rise. Now, the job of the Education Standards Commission, HMI, and the local inspectorate, which under Labour will not be privatised, will be to ensure not only are the questions asked, but they're answered. And if schools are not getting up to standard, they're set very clear programmes for raising standards. The Conservatives have no mechanisms for doing that. Ken Clarke's worst decision was to privatise the schools inspectorate, to dismember the local inspectorate. Schools may be inspected every 4 years by privatised inspectors under his scheme, but there is no process under his act by which, if there's a problem within the 4 years, any action can be taken.
But I mean, both the Liberal Democrats and you quite rightly talk about raising standards for all. Can you show me a society in the history of evolution that has equal standards for all children? It just hasn't happened. It's
well,
a dream,
I can show you a great many societies in Europe, for example, our European competitors, which are aiming to achieve much greater equality of standards and much greater equality of opportunity. One of the problems we have in this country, in England particularly, I can show you Scotland, by the way, where they have a better system which does provide much more equal opportunity for all, with virtually 100% of children in the comprehensive system and far fewer in the private sector. The problem we have is we have a fairly significant private sector, but what the Conservatives have done within the state sector is created a two-tier sector, a few schools well-funded, like CTCs and opted-out schools, with a majority neglected. Ken Clarke said a moment ago, well, we only started this process of what he called educational reform in 1987. That's untrue, Ken, and Ken should know that. They actually said in 1979, in their first manifesto, that they would raise standards of achievement for every child. They have failed to do that. HMI have said, Her Majesty's Inspectors, in the last 4 years that a third of children are getting a raw deal. There's been no improvement of standards. There's evidence from a major national study on reading standards that standards of reading of 7-year-olds have actually gone down in the last 4 years over precisely the period that these so-called reforms from Ken Clarke have been introduced.
We will try to make a lightning trip back to you as well, but let's visit Lord Holme, who's in Westminster. Good morning, Lord Holme. Can you hear me?
I can hear you
Excellent.
fine.
Now, you are promising more than the other two parties in terms of what we might call extra spending, £2 billion. What will be your priorities and what will lose out in that extra spending spree?
Well, what we've said, and I've listened with interest to what Ken Clarke and Jack Straw have said, we all share the aim of trying to improve British education. We believe, and that's why we've made it a central issue in this campaign, you can't do it without devoting substantial extra resources. Some of what Jack said I agree with very much, not all of it.
Some of what Kenneth Clarke said, presumably you agree with as well. You like the league tables, don't you?
We do like the league tables. What we don't like, of course, is a two-class education system. But if you ask what our priorities are really threefold. First of all, to make sure that every child has some preschool education and gets a good flying start. Secondly, in the schools themselves, to get the class sizes down and the standards up, and I think that that is a common aspiration for everybody. And thirdly, to make sure that there's much stronger post-school education. Now, if you take the centre section of that, the schools themselves, I really do believe it's a mistake for the government to be trying to privatise the HMI, Her Majesty's Inspectorate. We need an independent inspectorate, but we need it of the highest standards, properly resourced. And when you do that, then it makes it much more realistic to take action in the light of the league table. And Ken Clarke says we in particular say that if a school isn't doing so well, why waste money on that? He'd like to spend it all on the ones that are doing best. That cannot be right. It must be right in a society that wants all its children to have educational opportunity. Try and spend more money, which we're committed to, and we've said we're prepared to put tax up by a penny to pay for it, to spend it on all schools and make sure that the benefit isn't confined to an elite first class.
Very briefly, in the event of a hung parliament, what education bargaining chip would you be placing on the counter, do you think?
Well, I think...
Or is there room for one?
I don't want to do bargaining on this programme. We've yet to see what the electorate decide. But if no party has an overall majority, I believe that there could be a consensus in the House of Commons around the proposal we've made during this election campaign, which was really a very politically courageous one, which is to say, would you put a penny on tax? And the response to that's been very positive. Why don't Ken Clarke and Jack Straw build on that, and why don't we see if we couldn't have a great national crusade for better education?
Well, all three of you are apparently doing that, a huge crusade for better education, but we take your point. Let's whip around the studios. Kenneth Clarke in Nottingham, how many seats do you believe you'll win by on Thursday? We know you're a sporting man, you like the occasional bet.
I don't actually bet very much, but I certainly usually follow spectator sports. On this occasion, I'm a participant in this general election. I think we'll win, not by as much as we ought to do, but I think the polls today will concentrate people's mind. You're either going to have John Major or Neil Kinnock as Prime Minister. I think the last thing people want is a coalition, and Neil Kinnock there and a coalition government. People had better make their minds up. When they do, I think there'll be a drift back.
Win by, but not sure by how many votes should be
When
more.
we began, I said a majority of 20. I'd still settle for that.
Majority of 20. Jack Straw in Blackburn, how many votes, how many seats will you win by, do you think, on Thursday?
I think we'll have an overall majority, probably around 20, which is what Neil Kinnock predicted some time ago. Very interesting that the Conservatives are now effectively conceding a defeat, talking the language of defeat. That's the reason why John Major's been started to talk about a hung parliament. We've had a marvellous campaign. We're really well ahead in the key marginals in the East Midlands, where Ken Clarke is, West Midlands, in the North West. And
I just asked how many seats you're going to win by. Thanks, Jack Straw. Thank you, Jack Straw in Blackburn, Lancashire, and Lord Holme in Westminster. How many seats will you win?
Well, I believe that we're going to continue to move up to polling day, that our voters won't be scared off by the tactics of the other two parties, that at the end of the day the people won't want to give either of them an overall majority, and in that event the people will win. I think as far as we're concerned, we'll come out of this election with substantially more seats, particularly in the south and the southwest, than we went into the election with.
Well, thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us, Kenneth Clarke in Nottingham, Jack Straw in Blackburn, and Lord Holme in Westminster.